Hello, everybody, and welcome into Night with the Museum. My name is Chris. I'm your Adult Programs Coordinator, and it looks like our museum just had a little technical difficulty as they have popped off. So I'll be your entertainment for the next few minutes, I guess, until they find their way back to us. Um, we will be joined this evening by the Mississippi Civil or the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. They're actually two different museums. It's the Two Mississippi Museums is their formal name. Uh, but yeah, this is this is new to me. So uh, give me a second to reach out to them. Everyone hang tight. I'll be right back. Don't hang tight. They're here. All right, perfect. All right, now I will do my formal introductions and friendly Zoom reminders. So first off, our friendly Zoom reminders, if you have any questions for our speakers this evening, please feel free to throw those in the Q&A as we are going along. Uh, we will take all questions at the end of the presentation, but again, just throw them in as they come in your head so you don't forget them later. You'll notice that closed captions have been enabled and you can turn those on or off as you wish using your Zoom toolbar. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, my gosh, I can't speak. Technical difficulties this evening. Also, please feel free to reach out to me using the Q&A, and I'll do my best to go back and forth with you as we go along. All right. Now, for our friends over at the Two Mississippi's Museums, we have Drew Gardner, who is currently serving as the Director of Programs at the Two Mississippi's Museums, which is home of the Museum of Mississippi History. It's hard to say Mississippi so many times back to back, probably especially when you don't live there. And the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Having transitioned from a classroom educator, Drew brings a grounded understanding of K through 12 learners and community needs into museum and cultural heritage work. With a focus on interactive learning and inclusive programming, he leads the development of events, partnerships, and interpretive content that engage audiences across generations and backgrounds while advancing the mission of preserving and sharing Mississippi's rich history. He's joined by Sarah Brazier, the Director of Visitor Experiences at the Two Mississippi Museums, where she helps visitors connect with Mississippi's many stories through visits, group tours, programs, and special events. And I don't know if we're going to see him at any point, but there is a third friend over there helping us named Mike. Oh, I'm going to say this wrong. Bankowski. Um, and there's Mike's hand. So Mike will also be assisting us this evening as we go on our tour of, I've already gotten a little bit of a sneak peek, a very beautiful space and some very enthusiastic and dedicated museum professionals. So y'all are in some good hands this night. Drew, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, we are so excited to have you guys with us this evening. My name is Drew Gardner, and we are standing in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. I don't know if you can hear it with our microphone, but I'll show it to you in just a moment. But this space that we're in right now is right on the outskirts, the part of our museum here at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. It's called This Little Light of Mine. Every half hour, it plays freedom songs that are sung by civil rights activists. And it is very much the space that we kind of return to in each of our galleries. And this evening, we're going to focus on a very near and dear story to our museum. There's so many things that we thought about sharing with you guys, but we decided to focus on a piece of Mississippi history that's probably maybe a little lesser known. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer 2 years ago, and we're excited to share a little bit of that history with you guys this evening. But before we get started with the particulars of Freedom Summer, I want to kind of set a stage for you in Mississippi. Right here in Mississippi, one of our chief kind of leaders and activists that drove so much of what happened here in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement was a man by the name of Medgar Evers. Medgar was just barely, not even quite 30, when his experience becoming the state field secretary for Mississippi and the NAACP drastically changed much of his life. Medgar had been a World War II veteran. He was a high school dropout actually at the time to follow his brother. He's going to serve in World War II in Normandy. He's going to return home. He's going to make his way to Alcorn A&M College and be a dual sport athlete, as well as incredibly active in the many things on campus life there at Alcorn. But Medgar kind of comes to us as a central figure as we start to talk about this incredible story right here in Mississippi. Now, as we get started, I want to tell you a little bit more about this space before we get into the kind of nuts and bolts of the movement at this time. This space was a celebration of Mississippi's bicentennial. For years, this space had been planned actually for Tougaloo College, and in the late 2010s, it was decided to build this building as a celebration of Mississippi's 200th anniversary. And the state of Mississippi put up almost $100 million to make this building, as well as the Museum of Mississippi History. It's 2 museums in one building that tell a continuous story of basically 15,000-year survey at the Museum of Mississippi History and about a 35-year microscopic look at the nuts and bolts of Mississippi civil rights movement. But as we arrive here with this story of Medgar had spent about 8 years from 1954 to the summer of 1963 leading much of the civil rights movement. The early movement in Mississippi was held in pockets in places like Macomb and in Greenville and in Hattiesburg and in Canton. And it's those little pockets of civil rights activity that will eventually come together underneath the heading of the Council of Federated Organizations. This will be the first and only time that all 4 major civil rights organizations will come together underneath one leadership, underneath one headship. We'll see the Council of Racial Equality, CORE. We'll see the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and we'll see the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. All 4 come together underneath the primary leadership of Medgar Evers and Bob Moses and Dave Dennis. Those 3 men are going to be incredibly vital in the changing of Mississippi's life and culture right here in our incredible state. But as we kind of start to build the framework and the pieces of this museum, I want to kind of take you guys on a little bit of a walk as we make our way around. I want to point out the light sculpture that I mentioned earlier. You'll see names all across the outside of the space. You'll see this incredible light sculpture here, kind of symbolizing the beauty and the interconnectedness of the movement. You'll see heroes and sheroes of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. As we think about this movement, not as a movement of just the 1950s and 60s, but a movement that has existed as long as freedom has been denied in our state. And so as we make our way in to kind of start to begin some understanding of the Mississippi freedom struggle and the summer project of 1964, we actually start the year prior. In 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated just several weeks into a major campaign to challenge integration or challenge segregation amongst churches throughout the city of Jackson, where we're located right here. This project to challenge these churches was a desire to bring both Black and white moderates together on a common cause and this religious Christian identity that they both claimed. Ultimately, Medgar will be assassinated on June 12, 1963. For so many people, it's a flashpoint and a moment that is of pivotal importance, because we'll see for the first time the real challenging of Mississippi's movement, almost a breaking point, if you will. Medgar was there when Emmett Till was lynched in 1955. Medgar was alongside James Meredith in 1962 as he integrated the University of Mississippi. Medgar had been the primary glue that bound these 4 organizations together. He had been asked to join SCLC. He was friends with many of those young people and had raised them up in a nonviolent and active direct action protest of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members. And he was a staff member for the NAACP. And it's that glue that as Medgar is assassinated that begins to question what Mississippi is going to do, what it's going to become. Shortly after Medgar's assassination, one of the key ideas for the movement is going to challenge a long-held misconception, a lie, if you will, about Black men and women in Mississippi and about their right or lack thereof in the political process. And so as we make our way into this space, we'll see kind of this key foundational moment in the fall of 1963. Just months after Medgar has been assassinated, leaders of the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, is going to create what's known as the Freedom Vote. The Freedom Vote was a mock election, a decision to say,
let's actually show not only Mississippians, but the world that given the opportunity, Black men and women would indeed vote, and then vote in great numbers. And so an entire campaign is created in just several short weeks. That an entire campaign is created. Candidates are put up. Aaron Henry, the president, the state president of the NAACP, Ed King, a white Methodist minister who is the dean of students, of male students at Tuvalu College, will be put up as governor and lieutenant governor on this ballot. They'll hold registrations. They'll hold mock rallies. There will be an entire suite of political opportunities. And the idea is kind of twofold. There's this long-held lie in Mississippi history that Black people up until 1965 didn't want to vote, is why they didn't vote. Not that they were not allowed to vote. Now, Mississippi law in 1890, when it was established, that is Mississippi's both current constitution, but the constitution that will ultimately eliminate Black men from the electoral process. In 1890, that constitution is going to create comprehension tests. It's going to create literacy tests. It's going to create a poll tax system that ultimately is going to remove not only almost the entirety of the Black electorate from the political process, but also a number of poor white men and women, or white men from the political process. The calculus for these white Democratic leaders at the time is that it is worth it to remove Black men from this political process as a means of redeeming Mississippi in these years after Reconstruction, to change so much that it happened during those years of great progress in Mississippi immediately following the Civil War, to try and undo a public education system that Black legislators helped create in 1868. But chiefly, it became the desire to create a system that made it almost impossible for Black men and women to participate in the political process. And in 3 just weeks, those leaders will establish the freedom vote. And so while on one hand, it shows that given the opportunity, Black men and women would indeed participate in great numbers, but 2, it gave those men and women who maybe had attempted or attempted to register to vote and were denied by local county registrars using all kinds of flagrant means of handing them a jar of marbles and asking them how many marbles are in there, or a jar of jelly beans, or asking them how many feathers are on a chicken. All of these were items and ways that local county registrars, white men, used to prevent Black men and women from participating in this process. But the freedom vote gave them an opportunity to not only participate, but to practice for that day when it would no longer be a mock election, but an election with serious consequence to change radically the outlook of Mississippi. And that's exactly what happens. In 3 just weeks, we see the freedom vote go from inception all the way into nearly 90,000 Mississippians participate. We'll have heavy concentrations in the Mississippi Delta, as well as in just north of Mississippi, just north of Jackson, where we are right now, in Canton, Mississippi. Those will be 2 core pieces of great movement, as well as Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a logging town just south of Jackson, about an hour and a half, that we'll see an incredible kind of central hub of change that happens. But all in this space, we see this leading up to this desire to see change happen in Mississippi. And it's really the first time that we see these individual pockets that I mentioned previously go from individual pockets to a statewide campaign to encourage Black Mississippians to participate in the political process, to register to vote in numbers. And it's that space that starts to build into what eventually becomes Freedom Summer. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pitch it to my coworker, Sarah Brazier, who's going to talk to you a little bit about what happens in the early days of 1964 leading up to Freedom Summer.
All right, so as we come around into the next part of the gallery, I want to do an additional little bit of setting up the context. Drew's done a great job of setting up the local politics and politics of Freedom Summer with the Freedom Vote. But one of the other main pillars of the Freedom Summer process is education. There are three main pillars that we'll talk about. Drew's covered the background of the Freedom Vote, but Freedom Schools is another huge part of the Freedom Summer process. And so to provide some context for where this is coming in Mississippi, in this year in Mississippi, 63 going into 64, only 7% of schools in Mississippi are integrated, even though Brown versus Board of Education had happened in 55. That meant that African-American students were receiving a subpar education, regardless of the fact that in this era, Black educators and principals and counselors were by far more educated than their white counterparts. Most of them had either master's or doctorates, whereas their white counterparts only had bachelor's degrees. But because of the way that the state was restricting resources to Black schools, giving them subpar textbooks that were older, or honestly not giving them at all, as well as providing a different amount of money per student. In 54 up through this era in the 60s, Mississippi school children at white schools were being spent at about $70 a student, whereas in Black schools, it was only about $7 to $14, depending on what area of the state you're in. And so Black students are incredibly disadvantaged. And so while the politics and the voting aspect was a huge part of Freedom Summer, the second pillar of the Freedom Summer Project was these freedom schools. And it was a huge part of the movement. As Drew mentioned, Bob Moses and Dave Dennis are two of those leaders that take up Medgar's mantle after his assassination. And they both knew the power of education. They were both college educated, and they knew that that had given them a leg up in the world. And so they put out a call to college students to be a part of this Freedom Summer process. And they were very tactical and intentional in inviting these college students, both Black and in particular white college students, bringing them into the South, one, to expose them to a world that they had not seen, or if they had seen it, had only been seen in newspapers and in the news on television, and giving them a connection to these people that they had been told they were radically different from, but recognizing that common humanity through being a part of this process, but also giving them an opportunity to share the resources and things that they had learned through their educational opportunities. And so freedom schools are a huge part of the Freedom Summer process in 63 and 64. So like Drew mentioned, 63 is when the Freedom Vote happens. And so Freedom Summer is a little bit of a misnomer because the project starts almost immediately after the Freedom Vote, the planning process. And the next part that immediately starts is the Freedom Days, where students and locals are working to go and register to vote. So we've got several talking here that are in the early parts of the year. In January, they're working in Hattiesburg. In February, they're working in Canton. In March, they're working in Greenwood. And the big process that they are doing in this is that they are recognizing that there is safety in numbers. They had proven through that almost 90,000 participation rate in that Freedom Vote that they had the body of Mississippi in wanting to do this work. And so they really believed this, single registrar at the local county courthouse can't stop all of us from registering to vote. If we, get the best of us in organized and we come as a group to the courthouse, we can force them to either allow us to register to vote or to reject us in a patently unconstitutional way, which supports the legal effort as lawyers are working in Mississippi to protect these civil rights workers and also to fight on the legal grounds for civil rights. And so they're working all across the state in these marches where they're going to these county courthouses. They're attempting to register to vote. They're documenting when they're being prevented from doing that. And they're working very, very hard to fight for the vote while they are also planning the freedom schools that they will start in the summer. The other part of this educational movement is that the education resources for Black students is also limited in the time that students are being able to spend to school. Black students were often restricted from starting school until the crop had been harvested. And so whereas white students followed our education system that we still kind of had today of starting in late August or early September and going through till May, June, depending on how your school year is set up, Black students oftentimes did not start school until late October, early November, because they had to finish school before it was time to plant the next year's crop. They're finishing school in April rather than May or June, maybe even as early as March, depending on how the season is looking that year with weather. And so schools are restricting opportunities for Black students, and that's why the freedom schools are so important. In the similar ways that they're conducting these freedom days and voter drives all across the state, these freedom schools are also all across the state. The one freedom school in Hattiesburg was the largest. It had over 600 students participating in that freedom school. And they're learning things like they would in a traditional school: math, English, reading and writing, science, but they're also learning about Black history, things that weren't being taught in any school in Mississippi in this time, that's vitally important for these Black Mississippians to understand and uplift themselves, to understand their history, and also to be able to move forward from that history. The third pillar of the Freedom Summer Project was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, another area of politics. But before we get to them, we have to talk about one of the unfortunate sides of the Freedom Summer Project, and that is the reality of political violence in Mississippi. I mentioned that Bob Moses is being very intentional about bringing in white college students to be a part of the movement. Current college students or recent college graduates, they had to fill out incredibly detailed applications, and if they were under the age of 21, had to get parental permission to participate. They're answering questions about where do they get their news? Why do they want to be a part of the process? What political party are they affiliated with? Because they were very intentional about including students that were doing this for the right reason. They knew that they were going to be in the news, and so they weren't looking for people who just wanted to make it famous, or to be seen as good people. They wanted to have people who really believed in the movement, who wanted to make Mississippi and the United States a better place. Mississippi in this era is often called a closed society. And they knew that if we could open Mississippi, if Mississippi is considered the worst of the worst, if we can make change in Mississippi, we can make change in the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And unfortunately, this means a pendulum swing of political violence towards these individuals. And so as we come around to the next part of the gallery, we'll talk about what may be the only part of Freedom Summer you've heard about before, and that is Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, 3 Freedom Summer workers who were assassinated before the summer even really gets a start. James Chaney is a Black Mississippian who is from Meridian, Mississippi, just about an hour east of where we are right now in Jackson. And he is working as part of the movement, working as part of COFO, working with Bob Moses and others. And he is partnered with Mickey Schwerner, who is one of the earliest Freedom Summer volunteers. He comes down before the summer. He's part of those Freedom Days in the early months of 1964. He's a college graduate. He's married. His wife's name is Rita. They're both a part of the movement, working. He is a Jewish American. He's from New York, comes into Mississippi to be a part of the movement, working as part of these voter registration drives. He becomes good friends with James Chaney. And then later, closer towards the end of the summer, they are joined by Andrew Goodman, who is another Jewish New Yorker coming into Mississippi to be a part of the process. He is he's actually 20 when he initially joins and volunteers. He's just 21 years old when he comes into Mississippi. And as they're training in Oxford, Ohio, in preparation for the summer. They're learning about political nonviolence, about resisting violence when they are attacked, because they know as they come into Mississippi that they're going to be harassed. They know that from the lunch counter sit-ins, they know that from the freedom rides, that there's violence going to be done to them, and they prepare for that by learning to resist that, to behave nonviolently, even as they are being harassed and attacked. And so they do that work in Oxford, Ohio. When they hear from volunteers already in Mississippi working that one of the Freedom Summer sites, the Freedom School sites, has been bombed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Philadelphia, Mississippi is right outside Meridian. And so James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner volunteer to come down early to go to Philadelphia to check in with the congregation, make sure that no one has been hurt by this bombing, but also to start the process of figuring out, okay, if this church has been destroyed, where are we going? What other community center can we use in this area to make sure that this freedom school still is available to the Black students of Philadelphia? And it is while they are in Mississippi, just the second day that they are in Mississippi. Andrew Goodman is in Mississippi for only 2 days before they are murdered. And he sends a postcard to his parents up to that effect. I would encourage you to look it up online. It's very, very touching, talking about how the people of Mississippi that he is working with are incredibly friendly, and he's excited to be here. They go to the church, they are talking to the congregation, and they're headed back to their hotel when they are pulled over by the Neshoba County Sheriff's Department. They know when they're pulled over that they are likely to be arrested. They are arrested, they're sent to the local jail, they're held there, and they're held there until after dark. Just after 7 p.m., they are released of their own recognizance, allowed to leave again. But they know what's going to happen next, that they know that they are going to be followed. They know that they are going to be picked up again because, one, Philadelphia is a sundown town, a town that African Americans were allowed to live near and work in and contribute to in spending their money, but was not allowed to be a true community member. They're not allowed to be in town after dark, an unspoken rule in this era, many of them across the South. And they also know that the sheriff in Neshoba County is a Klansman. This is not a secret, this is well known. And so they're released, they're back in their car, they're driving, and they're pulled over again. This time, they're not pulled over by the police in their duties as police, they're pulled over by the Klan. The 3 men are beaten and killed, their car is burned and left in a ditch, and their bodies are buried elsewhere. All of this is happening before Freedom Summer has even technically really started. The Freedom Days and voter drives have been happening, but the school part of Freedom Summer has not started yet. And so back in Canton, Ohio, Bob Moses and the other volunteers know, because they have not heard from Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, that something has gone wrong. And they start the process of calling other volunteers in Mississippi, trying to find the 3 men. Their car is found, and this kicks off a storm of national attention in Mississippi. It is the third of 3 big events that really turn all of America's and the world's eyes on Mississippi. The first being the murder of Emmett Till, the second being Medgar Evers' assassination, and this one being the murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Before their murder, the FBI had actually not had a field office in Mississippi. This is what brings the FBI and the federal government back into Mississippi in kind of the first big way since Reconstruction and Grant's troops being pulled out of Mississippi. And they are investigating the death. It takes over 42 days for the men's bodies to be found. All the while, Freedom Summer is happening. These volunteers are coming into Mississippi. They are running these voter drives. They're running these schools and teaching, whilst also mourning and looking for their 3 murdered friends. And this is what kind of becomes the legacy of Freedom Summer. But all the while this is happening, all the while Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner are being mourned, the other political aspect of Freedom Summer is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and it's going towards the tail end of the summer. In this era, in Mississippi and across the South, the primary system in Mississippi meant that no women or African Americans can vote in a primary. Primaries were exclusively the purview of white men. And so even if you were able to register to vote and be a part of the Republican or Democratic Party, particularly the Democratic Party in Mississippi, you were not able to vote in the primary system, which meant that you really didn't have much of an opportunity to choose who your candidate was in elections. And Mississippians wanted to change that process. And so the 2 that we see behind me here, Bob Moses, who we've spoken up already, one of the key architects of the Freedom Summer Project, and Fannie Lou Hamer, amongst others, develop the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a new Democratic Party for Mississippi, one that is truly egalitarian, allows all colors and creeds to be a part of the members of the Democratic Party. And so their plan is to go to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and demand that they be seated instead of the existing Mississippi Democratic Party. They had been a part of the mock election process in the Freedom Vote. They had been running drives and registering members as part of their party. And so they go to the Atlantic City, New Jersey, to the Democratic National Convention. And while there, Fannie Lou Hamer gives an incredibly powerful speech about her experience living in Mississippi her entire life. Fannie Lou Hamer is a sharecropper. She only had about a third grade education. Despite that, she's an incredibly intelligent woman who works incredibly hard, who had learned about the civil rights movement later in her life and had decided to be a part of it. She had lost her job on the farm that she had lived almost her entire life. Her and her husband both had been kicked out of the farm that they sharecropped on because of her involvement in the movement, not just registering to vote, but going to interest meetings to learn about registering to vote. In addition to that, Fannie Lou Hamer spoke about in her testimony about her experience through Winona, Mississippi. They had gone to South Carolina for a SNCC event, I believe, and whilst they are coming back into Mississippi, their bus is pulled over for the crime of being too yellow. And whilst on that bus, it was obviously an excuse just to pull them over. They are all arrested and held in jail. And whilst in jail in Winona, Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer and others who are with her are beaten severely. And she's testifying to this experience whilst at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Unfortunately, the MFDP does not succeed in their goal of being seated instead of the existing Mississippi Democratic Party, partially because of the political machinations of President Johnson, who's hoping to be reelected. He gives an impromptu press conference during her speech at the conference in order to try and take news coverage away from it. He said he had to give an update on the investigation into JFK's assassination. There had just been an update. There was no new information. It was purely an excuse to get the news channels to shift away from the convention and away from Fannie Lou Hamer's really, really strong and important words to take away power from this woman who had power taken from her so many times already. She's an incredibly amazing woman, and she has a lot of experience being a leader in the movement. And despite the fact that the MFDP does not succeed in their initial goal of unseating the Mississippi Democratic Party, they do succeed in that this is one of many of events that have been happening in addition to other aspects of the Freedom Summer movement in other work that have been doing across the state, across the United States as a whole, had told President Johnson and others that lead to the following year and passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so this is kind of where we're going to wrap up the end of Freedom Summer with Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Drew's going to come back on camera so that we can chat for a minute if you have any questions as we go through. But I thank y'all for joining us and checking out a little bit of the museums and let us know if you have any questions.
We're going to set.
Yeah, we're going to
Yeah.
7.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to one more gallery.
We're going to keep moving a little bit as we make our way around. So as we make our way into the excuse. See,
Camera got disconnected.
we get. All right, sorry about that. So as we make our way into kind of this next space, as we wrap up this picture of what Freedom Summer looked like, I want to make sure we kind of have this kind of closing moment as we look at really the beginnings of what follows. And so as Sarah told you a little bit about what happens at the Democratic National Convention in the late winter of 1964,
It really builds us to a space where we start to see the creation and the foundation for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that following August. As we're kind of making our way into this this reality, Mississippi has been on the forefront of so many conversations about civil rights, not only locally, but across the nation. As Sarah talked to you a little bit about those volunteers, as they came in and as they shared their stories, not only as they connected their families and their friends from all across the nation and even the world into Mississippi that summer, they also left and they went back out to be advocates for what was happening here. I can't tell you how many times that we've engaged with stories with somebody coming back to say, I was in Canton in 64, I was in Philadelphia, or I made my way up to Benton County in North Mississippi. But this reality that Mississippi has this broad connection. William Faulkner has a quote that I'm sure many of you have probably heard, but that you can't understand the world until you understand a place like Mississippi. The reality of so much of Mississippi's experience is that the majority of Mississippi's time as a state, it has been one of the blackest states in the Union. Even to this day, Mississippi has the highest percentage of African-American residents than any state in the Union currently. Washington, D.C., if it earns statehood at one point, it will overtake that place. But right now, Mississippi still sits between 36 and 43% African-American, depending on census data. For so much of Mississippi's history, Black men and women have been denied the right to vote. And in 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in August, we see Black Mississippians show out to the polls in massive numbers. We begin to see Black men begin to serve in elected positions throughout the state legislature. Robert Clark is the first of those men to serve from Holmes County. Holmes County has this incredible story. We didn't talk about it as we were making our way through, but Holmes County, actually in the middle of 1963, Holmes County had a group of 14 individuals who decided to make it their mission to be able to register to vote, and they do. They're registered to vote. As a matter of fact, Holmes County for the longest time had the highest percentage of Black landowners who ensured their own safety by not being removed from their land. We talked about Fannie Lou Hamer, and she's removed from her very home for attempting to register to vote. And so what we see here is we see this progress. We see this growth that immediately follows 1964 and into 1965. But also in the same vein, not a year later, in 1966, January, the state of Mississippi will redraw its district lines. Frank Parker, a long academic and voting rights expert here in Mississippi, will call the movement a movement to move away from the removal of Black men and women from the political process. And now instead of removing the Black vote, we're going to dilute the Black vote. And so that redistricting, we'll see massive changes immediately following. Mississippi to this day still has been in court over its districting policies. But I want you to see in this space that Mississippi has this incredible story. We wanted to kind of give you a story that maybe a piece that you hadn't heard, or a part that you maybe weren't familiar with. Mississippi and Chicago and Illinois in general have an incredible connection through the Great Migration, through the story of Emmett Till. And so we hope to bring you something that would resonate. We hope to bring you something that would bring you into this museum. If you are ever in Jackson, Mississippi, we would love to be able to see you and have you in this space. It is incredibly expansive. We've gone through maybe a fourth of all of the spaces that we have in this incredible museum. And so we would love to be able to show this to you. And so we hope that if you ever have the opportunity to make a chance and make a visit to Jackson, we would love to see you and love to host you. But this time, we love to kind of make a little switch. I know we've got plenty of time for questions. And so, Christopher, we can kind of bounce off any questions that you may have as we get rolling from here.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. That was amazing. If anyone out there watching has any questions for our speakers, please throw those in the Q&A and we'll field them to them. I guess my first question you guys have such a beautiful museum. Do you have, for both of you, do you have a gallery you're the most drawn to, that you're the most proud to show off?
I think the obviously the most proud to show off is going to be Gallery 3, just because it's got the light sculpture, it's got a round seating area, we've got the music of the movement sung by veterans for this museum. We didn't find archival recordings. We got connected with veterans who were still alive as we were preparing to open the museums, and connected them with a choir here in Mississippi and recorded these songs special for the museum. So it's really incredible space as we've gotten to know some of these veterans. Getting out, being able to pick out their voices as they're singing is really incredible. But it also offers a really helpful opportunity when we're giving tours, particularly to our K through 12 students, of offering some respite. The Civil Rights Museum is an incredibly important story, but it is also a really difficult story for a lot of people to process, whether they are young children and young students, or also people who lived through this era of history. And so having this space that each of the galleries weaves in and out of, giving you an opportunity that as you learn something hard or remember something hard from an area of time that you lived in, you also get an opportunity to rest in the joy of the movement, the music that they sung. Often these songs were sung at the end of meetings when they're all together. And so celebrating that joy here in the space, while we also honor the martyrs of the movement as their names are all displayed in this space, is really important.
Yeah, one of kind of my favorite stories we didn't share about Freedom Summer is actually all along the walls in this space. As a matter of fact, what we'll do is we'll spin around here, Mike, so that way they can kind of see some of this gallery that we're talking about. But as we spin here, you'll be able to see that there are illustrations all across the wall. These illustrations were created actually in Freedom Summer. A man by the name of Tracy Sugarman was invited by Miss Fannie Lou Hamer to come here to Mississippi and to participate in Freedom Summer. So much of his kind of thoughts when he engaged with Miss Hamer was, what am I going to do? I'm an artist. I'm an illustrator. What do I have to bring? And she's going to tell him to bring his whole self, to bring all that he is, all that he has, and come to Mississippi. And so that's what he'll do. He'll come and he'll illustrate these images all along the walls, all throughout this space, and give us this beautiful kind of snapshot into Mississippi's history in 1964. And part of the beauty of Tracy Sugarman's story is not that he was a superhero or had any set of super skills or was a super great organizer or speaker. It is this beautiful picture that the civil rights movement is this beautiful collection of regular men and regular women and regular children who made decisions every single day to try and make Mississippi a better place. And in doing that, they brought their whole selves. They brought their gifts, their talents, and their abilities. And it's that beautiful creation of all of those individual gifts and talents and ideas that created something incredible. It's a space that, as we look at the history of Mississippi and the state of Mississippi today, that gives us hope, because it's a space that we can know the incredible genius, the incredible joy, the incredible passion and care that exist all throughout this state. It's a space that brought, for Sarah, coming to Mississippi and growing up as a Mississippian, for me, that's brought me here. I'm not originally from Mississippi, but I've been here for 15 years. I've got Mississippi kids. This is my space. And so it's a space that brings us a lot of hope, a lot of joy, and a space that we get to kind of rest and reflect. It's also a space, if you ever get to come and join us in person, what sets us also really apart in this space is one of our staff members is a man by the name of Hezekiah Watkins. He was 13 years old when he got pushed into a Greyhound bus station, and it started a 60-plus year journey of civil rights activism that's resulted in over 100 arrests. It resulted in multiple days at Parchman Penitentiary, the state prison, on death row as a child. But it's that story that he shares with our guests as they walk in, as our K-12 students, as they sit at his feet and listen to the very mouth that lived the experience that sets this space truly apart from anywhere else. And so it's a space that we love to invite people in. It's a space that I wish tonight you guys had an opportunity to hear from Hezekiah, but at least we get to bring you and invite you into this space to see the sculpture, to see the pictures, to hear some of the songs of what really is the heart of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was just wow. out of this world. What a powerful space to get to work in every day and to educate people and to know that you are creating a generation's worth of change through the stories you're sharing and telling, and the people you're bringing into the space. It's amazing. We do have an online question. Do you have anything either in your gallery space for the Civil Rights Museum, or maybe it's something in your archives that you haven't brought out before or yet, relating to Martin Luther King or Emmett Till?
Absolutely. So why don't you talk about Emmett? We'll start there, and then I'll share a little bit about King.
Yeah, so we actually have quite a bit related to Emmett. Not everything, a lot of stuff related to Emmett is also held by the Smithsonian. His original casket is held by the Smithsonian. But here at the museum, we have a couple of things. We have an original Jet magazine that used, the photography of his mother, Mamie Till Mobley's incredibly strong choice to have an open casket funeral that helped share that story even wider and allowed the country to be forced to look at what had happened to Emmett in Mississippi. We also have some harder artifacts, one actually that is only recently obtained by the department and by the museums, and that is the gun that was believed to be used in Emmett's murder. We cannot really confirm with the FBI for sure, but we are, I would say, personal opinion, 95% certain that this is the gun that was used to kill Emmett Till, and the holster that went along with it, that we have on display in the museum now. And it's a complicated object, not only because it's a murder weapon, but also because of what it represents, and wrestling with these ideas that museums often wrestle with of what parts of history do we preserve and what parts of history do we preserve and display. And we really fell back on the idea that we have some really incredible relationships with Emmett's existing family, including one of his cousins, Reverend Wheeler Parker Jr., who is the only living witness to Emmett's kidnapping, and that he really believed that once we had the opportunity to obtain that weapon, that it was important that we follow through with that and that we put it on display so that we can ensure that we are telling with fidelity the story of what happened to Emmett while he was here in Mississippi. In addition to that, we also have the doors to Bryant Grocery Store. If you were to look up Bryant Grocery Store today, the building has almost nearly collapsed. There has been efforts in the past by the state to obtain it, by private actors to obtain it in order to turn it into a museum. And unfortunately, the family that owns it, not the Bryant family, but the family that owns it, wants an exorbitant amount of money for it, and has been allowed it to fall into disrepair. But we have the doors that Emmett would have gone through when he went to Bryant Grocery Store on that fateful day, that summer of 1954. And so they're really powerful in connecting particularly young people who visit the museums, who were Emmett's age, as they're visiting the museums, to engage with those stories as they learn about Emmett, some of them for the first time.
Yeah, if you were to come and do a visit and a tour, the Emmett Till space, not only do we have these artifacts, but a film that's narrated by Oprah Winfrey, a space that really kind of brings you into this moment of the catalyst of this horrific moment in our history, and how it connects not only just to Mississippi's history, but the nation and the world at large. In regards to Dr. King, we have a number of not necessarily artifacts on Dr. King. He didn't spend a lot of time in Mississippi. That's one of the things, makes us very unique here. Not that he didn't spend time, but this is a Mississippi specific story. Dr. King would come and go. Actually, as a matter of fact, as I was standing outside that previous gallery, just to my left was an image of Dr. King standing kind of split apart from Stokely Carmichael, now known as Kwame True. But Dr. King was here for a couple of different opportunities, but for the most part, Dr. King's experience and time that he spends in Mississippi is very limited. We'll see that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference doesn't have a very strong presence in Mississippi. While it had such a drive and impact in 1963 in Birmingham,
there doesn't become that same kind of level of commitment. And truthfully, part of that is because Mississippi has a very strong local people movement. That's not to say that other movement pieces at different states and different communities didn't, but Mississippi, outside of Medgar, doesn't have this primary driving force. Bob Moses is a key actor and character in Mississippi's history, but he's not here the whole time.
Yeah.
He shows up kind of midway into the scene. He does a lot of organizing, but then he leaves. But what we see here in Mississippi is that Mississippi is truly a movement of local people. And I think truthfully, as we look at the civil rights movement as a whole, that it's not a movement of great men that we followed, but an incredible movement of local people who made decisions on their own local community level that made drastic kind of national, statewide, and communal differences in the spaces in which they lived. And so the kind of limitations of Dr. King is we have him here in to answer the question a little more specifically, we have him when he's here in 1966 for the March Against Fear after James Meredith is shot on his walk from Memphis. We have him here in the 1950s as he is a primary speaker for the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, a kind of small Delta-based organization of civil rights leadership founded by Dr. T.R.M. Howard in the Mississippi Delta town of Mound Bayou. We'll see him here in Grenada, as a matter of fact, shortly after the March Against Fear, because during the March Against Fear, they had a pretty strong impact in Grenada as they were making their way from Memphis to Jackson. And so we'll see him start to set up a little bit of a hub and participate in the integration of public schools in Grenada. But really, outside of those kind of three big moments, we don't have a lot of time that we'll see that Dr. King actually spends right here, boots on the ground in Mississippi.
Yeah, I'd say the only things that we have in the museum that are Dr. King related are going to be photographs. I don't believe we have any artifacts, none on display, and I don't believe we have any in the collection either that are going to be from Dr. King.
There are some great stories that we've heard over the years as we've gotten to know civil rights activists and veterans who have lived or taught or gone to school on campuses like Tougaloo College, who will tell stories about Marlon Brando and Dr. King sitting in their living room floor eating a meal on a paper plate as they finished the final leg of the March Against Fear in 1966 on the campus of Tougaloo College. And so there's some great stories, some great remembrances that we hear from local community historians and leaders. But from an artifact standpoint, we're pretty limited.
Yes.
Wonderful. So I have a question. As a museum, my patrons and I, we've been on this journey for about 2 years now. We've gotten to see so many wonderful museums, all telling different kinds of stories. And it's ranged from things like, hey, look at this cool video game, to let's talk about this extremely, in your case, deep-rooted, very emotional story and journey. And what do you do as a museum and as museum professionals to make sure you're respectfully telling these stories, and how to make sure you're using, oh gosh, I knew how I was going to word this and I've lost it, but to make sure that you're going about this in a way that pays wonderful homage to the people who've had to live this and pave this way and create this opportunity for education and growth for us as a community and as a people. How do you do that as a museum professional?
I think the first big answer to that is that we have had really great leadership in this area. Our founding director, Pamela Jr., was chosen to be the initial director of the Civil Rights Museum because of not only being an incredible museum professional, working as a museum director for the city of Jackson for about 20 years before she was brought on here, but she had really incredible ties to the community, that she had grown up in Jackson, had lived through this area, and had developed personal relationships with many of these veterans, was a huge part of the process of getting a lot of the artifacts that we have on display here to be displayed here. Being the first and only state-funded civil rights museum is a bit of a political minefield as they are preparing to open these museums, because understandably, a lot of Black Mississippians have distrust in the state. And so when it became not fully a public project, but also a state-funded project in building these museums, there were a lot of veterans who justifiably were a little hesitant to contribute their stories, to contribute those artifacts. And Pam was a great leader in that, in emphasizing the importance of developing individual relationships with those veterans and with the current members of these communities. one of the incredible ways that we're able to do this work is through the William F. Winter and Elise Winter Education Endowment. William Winter was a governor in Mississippi. He's known as the education governor. He was a huge proponent for these museums. And even before he passed, he had given lots of money to the museums to create an endowment. But after he passed, left a ton of money to the museums to create an education endowment to allow students to visit the museums for free. So any K through 12 student in the state of Mississippi, whether they're public school, private school, homeschool, can visit the museums for free, get a tour from one of our educators as they go through, get to spend some time. And there's additional money that helps with transportation and with lunches when they're here at the museum. And so it's a very community focused institution, not just us as an institution, but also us as individuals. It's been incredibly important for us to develop individual relationships. We have one here in the museum every day in Hezekiah. He's not just a coworker to us. He is also a friend and in some ways a family member to a lot of us. Drew was, blessed to have known him before he worked here and teaching his grandchildren at school before he came to the museums, but also creating relationships with these people, which is really incredible to say as someone who works at a pretty incredible museum, to be able to say that, Rena Evers, Medgar Evers' daughter, knows your name and gives you a hug when she sees you and cares about you and your family is incredibly important in both creating that trust relationship that when they come to the museum, they know that they can pop on any tour that's happening and the stories are being told with fidelity because we find it incredibly important that we are telling the stories as they have been told to us, that we're combining historical research done by historians, written in books. There's really great books. Local People is an incredible example of a book about the movement in Mississippi, but also that we're balancing that with the lived experiences of those veterans who have left us through their oral histories and those who are still around and visit with us to make sure that, the history book doesn't always match these things. The Emmett Till story is a perfect example of stuff in the history book and stuff in the historical record not quite matching up with the story that the family experienced, and being able to correct those narratives, to offer those narratives when there's multiple of them, and making sure that people know that we are not really the experts in these stories, that we have been entrusted by the experts to tell these stories, but whenever possible, to point people to those stories, to point people to Hezekiah, to point people to Flonzie Brown Wright, to point people to Rena and her mother Merle, to point people to oral histories that have been done by the University of Southern Mississippi, who does a lot of oral histories in this area, to point them to the Library of Congress that has an incredible resource of civil rights oral histories, and to point them to the lived experiences of the people and not just the dry history book side of it.
Yeah. There's a reality that these museums are dynamic. They are a creation of the people of Mississippi. They are the telling of Mississippi's story. And we always have to have this reality that we talk about, that there's flesh and blood involved here. These are not static names. These are not two-dimensional figures. These are mothers and fathers. These are sons and daughters, men and women. And so for us to get to have the power of place, to have the power of community that was instilled long before any of us ever arrived here, long before these buildings were even built, to get to participate in that for us is a huge piece of taking these incredibly difficult stories that when we wrap up at the end of the day still cut, and they have to. Otherwise, it's disingenuous. It stops being real in some ways. And so as we go through, there's that reality of making sure that we tell these stories with the same vitality that these stories were lived. And so that becomes a huge piece for us as we make our way through sharing this incredibly powerful and rich and difficult history with our guests.
Wonderful. Another question from online. How did you get the doors to the grocery store?
Those were an interesting one. So the project to build the museums was a incredibly long project. Local community members have been trying since the mid-90s to build a museum somewhere in Mississippi. Mostly a lot of names that were being tossed around were particularly in Jackson, since it was where Medgar was assassinated, kind of the central of the state, central of the movement. And once it became a state project in the early 2000s, we broke ground here in 2012. And so that period of time between 2012 and 2017, when we opened during the bicentennial, our collections department was doing a massive statewide, even, countrywide search for civil rights artifacts in Mississippi. We were incredibly lucky to have a relationship with Tougaloo College that already had a lot of these materials, primarily because a lot of their faculty and students had been a part of the movement and had developed a relationship with them. But it was through that process that the doors had been missing for quite some time. It was during that call, when we're putting out calls all across the state and across the country, asking for artifacts to be donated or to be offered for purchase, that someone anonymously reached out to Nan Prince, our director of collections, and said, "Hey, I've got these doors in my barn. I think they may be from the Bryant grocery store. If you want them, come get them." And so she and some others were able to go into the Delta to this property to verify that they were in fact the doors from Bryant grocery store, and then bring them back for conservation and to be held, to be put on display here in the museum.
It's wonderful. Now we are right at time, and I want to be respectful of the time you've given and the respectful of the time we've asked of our patrons, but I want to wrap with one final question for both of you. What is, and this is a big question to be like, here, chunk it down to this tiny little idea. What is something about working in this museum and telling these stories that has changed the way? Oh no, your camera died. I'm assuming we can still hear you though. What is you know what, I'll give you a second before I say things because you're probably working on your camera. There we go, perfect. Hello. What is something, are you guys good or do you need a second? Good, perfect. What is something about working in this museum, telling these stories, and it can be about the civil rights side or the history museum side, either or, that changes the way you both interact with the world?
So I think for a big piece for me, so I came to this space in 2020, or excuse me, 2022, after being a school teacher for a long time. And for me, the piece that brought this in is the story of Medgar. It's why I started there. My son is named after Medgar Evers. As a matter of fact, shortly after Medgar was assassinated, Margaret Walker Alexander wrote a series of poems called Prophets for a New Day, where she compared Old Testament prophets in the Bible to civil rights veterans. And she compared Medgar to the Old Testament prophet Micah. And that's where ultimately my son's name came from. And for me, this has been a space of great joy, of passion, where as a school teacher, I was coming here during the summer to get ideas for lesson plans. And so the idea of getting to be here and be in this space, and then the first couple of weeks of getting to meet Rena Evers, his only daughter, the only surviving child that he had, to get to be in that space, to tell those stories, it was absolutely, it was the seal. It's what I think about every day when I come into work.
Yeah. So Drew called me a Mississippian. It's pretty accurate, but not entirely. I grew up all over the country, but my dad's originally from Jackson. And so when we moved to Mississippi when I was in middle school, Mississippi very much became my home. And moving to Mississippi was something that a lot of my teachers and classmates from where I had previously lived looked on with derision. Mississippi, as we all know, is often the first in everything bad and the last in everything good. And so there was a lot of judgment that my family was choosing to come back to our roots and be here. And these museums are the perfect encapsulation of the good and the bad of Mississippi, of being able to show off everything that we've done really well, that we are striving to do more of every day, but also an honest recognition of where Mississippi has failed. And giving opportunities through that. And so as someone who didn't really know what they wanted to do with their career after school, went on to get a graduate degree, choosing to come back to Mississippi and make Mississippi my home again was really important to me, to kind of prove the naysayers wrong, that Mississippi is a place that can be someone's home, and that's a good thing. But also that we have an incredible history. The History Museum covers 15,000 years. The native peoples of Mississippi have lived here for an incredibly long time, and they're an incredibly resilient people, really a model for what Mississippi could look like. And then also the civil rights veterans that worked incredibly hard to fight for Mississippi to be a better place, not only for themselves and their children, but for me and my children as well. And so getting to tell these stories is an incredible honor. And getting to have relationships with people like Rena, people like the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, is a really, really cool thing to be a part of every day.
Well, thank you both so much. Those are wonderful. Just, I'm so glad that this museum has people as passionate as you behind it to share these stories and keep this wonderful space growing. A lot of thank yous from our patrons in the chat. So I want to make sure you guys can get on with the rest of your evening. Thank you for one of the probably the most technically advanced night with the museums we have had this entire time, and for putting so much effort into sharing with my patrons. And thank you guys for coming out and joining. It's too late for me. Joining us for another night with the museum. I hope to see you guys next time. We are not stopping this train. December 16th, 7 to 8 p.m. We will be with the Museum of Chinese in America. So make sure you guys register. Registration for that is live already. And don't worry if you're like, where can I register? I'm going to send you a link because I want to make sure you keep coming. So I will see you all next time. And to our friends at the two Mississippi museums, thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you,
real
guys.
quick before you go, I would encourage everyone to check out our social media, particularly our YouTube page, Mississippi Department of Archives and History. We have a weekly lecture series called History is Lunch that Drew runs,
see you
that
tomorrow.
has an incredible backlog of stories from Mississippi. And so if in particular, if you're looking more information on Hezekiah, who we mentioned, who works here, he has a book, and his book was one of the History is Lunch series. So I'd encourage y'all to check that out.
I'll make sure to include a link to your YouTube in our after action email, but I also do for our friends at home, if you want to learn more about the museum, we do have a link to their museum's webpage in there as well. So I'll make sure to include that one too. Thank everyone so
Awesome.
much.